Tully woke to silence, which was her first clue that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Not the comfortable silence of deep space, mind you, or even the gentle hum of life support systems that every ship-dweller learned to sleep through like a lullaby. No, this was the pointed, deliberate silence of mischief accomplished, the kind that made experienced parents everywhere break into a cold sweat. She blinked at the ceiling of her quarters aboard the Pathmaker, a research vessel that had seen better decades and wasn't shy about reminding everyone through creative mechanical groans. The chronometer on the wall read "Lee," which meant she was supposed to have been awake, dressed, and halfway through her second cup of coffee by now. Instead, she was still horizontal, her brain fighting through the fog of sleep to understand why her alarm hadn't. Oh no. Tully sat up fast enough to make her vision swim, already knowing what she'd find before she looked. There, on her bedside table, sat her alarm device, or rather, what she could see of it beneath approximately 60 kilograms of combined predator-cub. 3 sets of crystalline whiskers caught the dim lighting like fiber-optic cables, and 6 pairs of eyes, bioluminescent and utterly shameless, blinked at her in perfect synchronization. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, running a hand through her hair, which had achieved what could only charitably be described as structural integrity optional status overnight. Moku, the smallest of the 3 Mkar cubs, sat directly on top of the alarm, with the smugness of someone who'd just solved world hunger by eating all the food. His iridescent patches of fur, marking him as what the Ixarans called a dawn coat, shimmered with each breath. Beneath him, providing foundational support to this architectural achievement of noise suppression, sprawled Obsidian and Lunk. Obsidian, true to his name, sported fur so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, broken only by those telltale crystalline whiskers that marked all Mkar as the apex predators they were bred to be. He had wedged himself into the narrow space between the table and the wall with the determination of someone committed to the bit. And then there was Lunk, the largest of the trio, whose 6 legs sprawled in directions that defied both geometry and common sense. He'd positioned himself as the base of this furry pyramid and was currently making a sound that could have been purring or could have been a small engine failing to turn over. With Mkar, it was honestly hard to tell. "How long have you 3 been plotting this?" Tully asked, swinging her legs out of bed. The cubs watched her with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood every word and were currently workshopping their defense strategy. "Because I'm guessing this wasn't a spontaneous decision. This has premeditated written all over it." Moku chirped, a sound that started in his chest and came out as something between a bird call and a door hinge that needed oil. It was the Mkar equivalent of "who, us?" and it was absolutely not going to fly. "Don't even start," Tully said, pointing a finger at him while simultaneously trying to extract her alarm from beneath the pile. "I have a meeting with the Exxaran delegation in—" She glanced at the chronometer again and felt her stomach drop. "Approximately -15 minutes, and you 3 have just made me look like an amateur who can't even keep track of time." The cubs remained unmoved, literally. Lunk yawned, displaying an impressive array of teeth that could punch through hull plating if properly motivated, and then settled more firmly into his position. "Mutiny," Tully declared, giving up on the alarm and heading for her closet. "That's what this is. Mutiny by fluff and cuteness, which is honestly the most insidious kind." She'd been caring for the cubs for 6 weeks now, ever since the mining accident on Ixaran Prime had collapsed their den and killed their mother. The Exxaran government had been less than enthusiastic about human coalition personnel recovering the cubs, But Tully had pulled rank as the senior xenobiologist on site, citing about 30 different protocols that boiled down to, you can't just leave babies to die, even if they're babies with teeth like diamond saws. The brass had backed her up, mostly because refusing would have looked bad on the news feeds, and the cubs had been transported to the Pathmaker for temporary care pending diplomatic resolution, which was bureaucrat speak for, we'll figure this out later, probably. Later, as it turned out, was today. Tully pulled on her duty uniform, dark blue with the xenobiology insignia that made her look approximately 30% more official, and caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her hair was beyond help at this point, so she twisted it into something that could generously be called a bun, and secured it with enough pins to pick several locks. "Okay, gentlemen," she said, turning back to the cubs, who had not budged a millimeter. "I need you to understand something. Today is important. Today decides whether you get to stay here, where people treat you like the intelligent beings you are, or whether you get shipped back to Exxaran, where," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "where things are different." Moku's ears flattened slightly, and his bioluminescent eyes dimmed. The crystalline whiskers that protruded from his face and flanks, sensory organs that could detect everything from electromagnetic fields to emotional states, quivered with what Tully had learned to recognize as anxiety. "Hey, no, none of that," she said, softer now, crossing back to the table. She carefully extracted Moku from the pile, cradling his surprisingly dense form against her chest. He was the size of a large house cat, but weighed about as much as a medium dog, all muscle and predator. Efficiency. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you three. That's a promise." Moku pressed his face into her shoulder, and she felt the vibration of that almost purr against her collarbone. Obsidian and Lunk, freed from their compression duties, stretched with the languid grace of creatures who had nothing but time and no concept of consequences. "But," Tully continued, setting Moku down and giving both other cubs a pointed look, "you have to promise me something too. No escaping the habitat today. No incidents. No making Lieutenant Ox look bad in front of the delegation, because he's already convinced you're going to eat someone important. And I'd really like to prove him wrong." Lunk chuffed, which could have meant agreement or could have meant, "That's hilarious. Watch this." Again, with Mkar, interpretation was an art form. The door chime sounded, and Tully closed her eyes for a long moment. She knew that chime pattern. Everyone on the Pathmaker knew that chime pattern. It was the auditory equivalent of an approaching thunderstorm. "Come in, Ox," she called, scooping up her data tablet and trying to look like someone who had been awake for hours and was totally in control of her life. The door slid open with a hydraulic wheeze that the maintenance crew kept promising to fix, and Lieutenant Ox stepped through. He was a man built like his name suggested, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with the kind of military bearing that made even his casual movements look like drills. His uniform was pressed to the point of being a safety hazard, and his expression suggested he'd just bitten into a lemon and was too polite to spit it out. "You're late," he said, which was both accurate and unnecessary. "I'm aware," Tully replied, grabbing her jacket from where she'd thrown it over a chair the night before. "Technical difficulties." Ox's gaze slid to the cubs, who were now arranged on her bed, in a tableau of perfect innocence. Moku had even managed to make his eyes larger somehow, a trick that Tully was convinced he'd learned specifically to manipulate humans. "They sabotaged your alarm," Ox said. It wasn't a question. "They were sitting on my alarm," Tully corrected, shrugging into her jacket. "There's a difference. One implies malicious intent, the other just implies poor furniture choices." "Tully!" I know," she cut him off, moving toward the door. Meeting, delegation, potential interstellar incident. I'm going. But Ox didn't step aside. Instead, he looked at her with something that might have been concern, if his face ever allowed such radical expressions. The Ixarans are not happy about this situation, he said quietly. Ambassador Lixapora brought a full security detail. Commander Kumthul has been asking pointed questions about our weapon systems. Tully felt something cold settle in her stomach. That's not standard diplomatic protocol. No, Ox agreed. It's not. They looked at each other for a long moment. The kind of moment where entire conversations happened in the space between heartbeats. Ox thought the cubs were dangerous. Tully knew they were dangerous, but there were different kinds of dangerous, and only one of them involved an innocent species being treated like ammunition. I'll be careful, Tully said finally. Ox nodded, stepping aside. See that you are. Captain Imogen wants this resolved without requiring her to file incident reports. You know how she gets about paperwork. Homicidal? Tully suggested. Creative, Ox corrected, but there was the ghost of a smile there. Which is worse? Tully moved into the corridor, then paused, looking back at her quarters where 3 pairs of luminescent eyes watched from the doorway. Keep an eye on them? She asked. I'll post someone outside your quarters, Ox said, though I'm not sure what they're supposed to do if 60 kilos of apex predator decides it wants to go for a walk. Pray, Tully offered. That's not in the security manual. Then improvise. You're good at that. She left before he could respond, her boots echoing on the deck plating as she headed toward Conference Room 3, where several very important, very angry Ixarans were waiting to discuss the fate of 3 cubs who had just that morning proven they were smart enough to commit alarm clock assassination. This, Tully reflected, was either going to go brilliantly or end with her being court-martialed. She was giving it about 30-70 odds, and not in her favor. Conference Room 3 was what happened when military efficiency met diplomatic necessity, and both decided to compromise by being equally uncomfortable. The table was too large, the chairs too rigid, and the lighting had that particular quality of making everyone look either washed out or vaguely criminal. Tully had always suspected this was intentional, a psychological tactic to make negotiations move faster because nobody wanted to stay longer than absolutely necessary. Today, however, the Exxaran delegation looked perfectly comfortable in their discomfort, which was somehow worse. Ambassador Lixapora sat at the far end of the table, her chitinous plating catching the overhead lights in ways that made her seem to shimmer. Ixarans were insectoid, in the way that nightmares were insectoid. Too many joints in their limbs, faceted eyes that saw in spectrums humans couldn't process, and mandibles that clicked when they spoke in a rhythm that suggested either language or threat assessment. With Ixarans, it was usually both. Specialist Tully, Lixapora said, her translator converting the clicks and whistles into something approaching human speech. How gracious of you to join us. We were beginning to think perhaps you had forgotten our appointment. The translator was good, but it couldn't quite capture the layers of sarcasm that Tully suspected were buried in there. Ixaran diplomacy was famous for being able to insult you in 6 languages simultaneously, while technically following every protocol. Ambassador, Tully replied, sliding into her designated chair with what she hoped looked like confidence, rather than the barely controlled panic she actually felt. My apologies. Unexpected complications. How fascinating, Commander Kumthul interjected from his position beside Lixapora. Where the ambassador was all polished plating and diplomatic poise, the commander looked like someone had taken the concept of military hardliner and given it mandibles and armor that seemed designed for function over form. Would these complications involve the stolen property we are here to discuss? Stolen property. Tully felt her jaw tighten, but forced her expression to remain neutral. If you're referring to the Mkar cubs currently under my care, then no. They were sleeping. Sleeping, Kumthul repeated, his mandibles clicking in what the translator unhelpfully rendered as expression of skepticism. How very domesticated of them. Captain Imogen, who had been sitting so still at the head of the table that Tully had almost missed her, cleared her throat. The captain was a woman who commanded through the power of strategic silence and the ability to make people question their life choices through eye contact alone. Perhaps we could move past the pleasantries and address the actual issue, she suggested, her tone making it clear this wasn't actually a suggestion. Lixapora's antennae twitched, which Tully had learned was the Ixaran equivalent of a conciliatory nod. Of course, Captain. The issue is quite straightforward. 3 Mkar cubs, sacred property of the Ixaran state, were removed from our world without proper authorization. We are here to facilitate their immediate return. They were orphaned in a mining accident, Tully said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Their den collapsed. Their mother was killed. Leaving them there would have been a death sentence. That is not your determination to make, Kumthul snapped, leaning forward with enough force that his chair creaked. Mkar are not pets. They are not curiosities for human study. They are sacred to our people, bound by customs and traditions that predate your species' first ventures into space. Sacred, Tully echoed, tasting the word. Something about it rang false, like a note played slightly off-key. If they're so sacred, why did it take you 6 weeks to request their return? The silence that followed could have been weaponized. Lixapora's faceted eyes seemed to focus and unfocus in a way that made Tully's skin crawl, and Kumthul's mandibles went completely still, which was somehow more threatening than any aggressive display. The proper diplomatic channels take time, Lixapora said finally, her tone carefully neutral. And the situation required delicate handling. Mkar cubs are precious. Their care is specialized. Their upbringing is critical to their development. Before Tully could respond, the ship-wide alarm blared to life with enough volume to make everyone flinch. The lights shifted to amber, and the computer's calm voice announced, "Security breach in Section 5. All personnel maintain current positions. Security teams respond." Section 5. That was the habitat, Tully breathed, already halfway out of her chair before Imogen's hand came down on the table like a gavel. "Sit. Down." The captain's voice could have cut steel. "Lieutenant Ox will handle it." "But the cubs—" "We'll be fine," Imogen interrupted, though her expression suggested she was less certain than her words. "Or they won't, and we'll deal with that when security reports in. Right now, you're going to sit here and explain to our guests why 3 apex predators are loose on my ship." Tully sat, mostly because her legs had decided to stop cooperating. Through the room's small viewport, she could see crew members rushing through the corridor, some heading toward Section 5, others away from it. Standard protocol for a containment breach, but standard protocol didn't account for the fact that the things that had breached containment were roughly the size of large cats and had the problem-solving skills of criminal masterminds. "This is precisely the issue," Kumthul hissed, his whole body seeming to expand with indignation. "Humans playing with forces they do not understand, treating sacred predators like living beings deserving of care," Tully shot back, her worry sharpening into anger. "Like intelligent creatures who were traumatized and needed help." Like weapons that you have failed to secure, Kumthul finished. And there it was. The word Tully had been dancing around since this whole situation started. Weapons. Not sacred. Not precious. Weapons. Lixapora made a sound that the translator didn't even attempt to process, and Kumthul's mandibles snapped shut so fast, Tully heard the click from across the table. Something had just happened in that exchange, something in whatever subsonic or chemical language Ixarans used when they didn't want translators picking up their meaning. "Commander," Lixapora said carefully, "perhaps we should wait for the security situation to resolve before—" Ox's voice crackled over Imogen's personal comm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Captain, we've got a situation. The Cubs aren't trying to escape. Well, you should probably see this." Imogen tapped her comm. "Define 'see this,' Lieutenant." "They're sitting outside Conference Room 3, ma'am. All three of them. They appear to be waiting." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Tully looked at Imogen, who looked at Lixapora, who looked at Kumthul, who looked like he'd just swallowed something toxic. "They tracked you," Imogen said to Tully, not quite managing to keep the surprise from her voice. "Through the entire ship." "Mkar have enhanced sensory capabilities," Tully said, already moving toward the door because protocol could go hang itself. "Their crystalline whiskers can detect electromagnetic signatures, thermal patterns, pheromones—" "They followed your scent," Lixapora interrupted, and something in her tone made Tully pause. The ambassador had half risen from her chair, her antennae rigid with what looked like alarm. "They imprinted on you. Bonded." "That's impossible," Kumthul declared, but he didn't sound certain anymore. "Mkar don't bond. They're conditioned from cubhood to respond only to Exxaran command pheromones. It's been this way for generations." Tully's hand was on the door control, but she didn't activate it. "Conditioned," she repeated slowly. "Not trained. Conditioned." The distinction was important. Training implied choice, teaching, relationship. Conditioning implied chemicals, control, the stripping away of will. Weapons. "Open the door," Imogen ordered, and Tully complied. 3 Mkar cubs sat in the corridor beyond, arranged in a loose semicircle with their backs to the conference room door. Their crystalline whiskers were fully extended, creating a shimmering perimeter around them, and their eyes, all 6 pairs, were locked on the security team that had formed a cautious barrier about 10 meters away. Moku chirped when he saw Tully, a sound of pure relief, and immediately tried to bolt toward her. Obsidian and Lunk moved in perfect synchronization, cutting him off and herding him back into position with the efficiency of a well-trained unit. They weren't trying to get to Tully. They were guarding the door, protecting her from something they perceived as a threat. "They knew," Tully said quietly, looking at Ox, who stood with his weapon holstered, but his hand never far from it. "They silenced the alarm this morning because they didn't want me to come to this meeting. They were trying to protect me." "From us," Lixapora said, and she didn't sound surprised. She sounded tired, in the way that someone who'd been carrying a heavy secret for too long sounded tired. "They sensed Commander Kumthul. They know what he represents." Kumthul pushed past Tully into the corridor, and the effect on the cubs was immediate and terrifying. They didn't attack, didn't make a sound, but every line of their bodies went from protective to predatory in the space between heartbeats. Lunk's lips pulled back from his teeth. Obsidian's fur seemed to absorb even more light. And Moku, tiny, affectionate Moku, looked like he was calculating exactly which vital organ to target first. "Stand down," Kumthul barked, and Tully smelled it then, a sharp chemical scent that made her eyes water. Command pheromones, the ones he'd said all Mokhtar were conditioned to obey from cubhood. The cubs didn't move, didn't react, just kept staring at him with those luminescent eyes, waiting. "They're broken," Kumthul said, and there was something almost like fear in his voice now. "These cubs are defective. They don't respond to the conditioning protocols." "No," Lixapora corrected, softly, still standing in the conference room doorway. "They were never conditioned. They're what Mokhtar are supposed to be." And that, Tully realized as Ox moved between her and the cubs, with the resignation of someone who'd just accepted that his job had become infinitely more complicated, was when everything truly fell apart. The standoff lasted approximately 15 seconds before Imogen made an executive decision that probably violated at least 3 diplomatic protocols and possibly several laws of physics. Everyone back in the conference room, now, including the cubs. "Captain, I must protest," Kumthul began, but Imogen cut him off with a look that could have flash-frozen hydrogen. "Commander, you just attempted to chemically control living beings on my ship without authorization. Right now, my protest carries more weight than yours. Inside. All of you." Tully had never loved her captain more than in that moment. The cubs followed her into the conference room without hesitation, Moku practically glued to her left leg, while Obsidian and Lunk flanked her with the precision of a trained security detail. They arranged themselves beneath the table at her feet, a warm pile of fur and crystalline whiskers and barely suppressed violence. Ox took up a position by the door, his hand still hovering near his weapon, though Tully noticed he was watching Kumthul more closely than he was watching the cubs. "Interesting." "Ambassador," Imogen said, once everyone had settled into the kind of tense silence that preceded either breakthroughs or breakdowns, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what, exactly, Mokhtar are to your people." Lixapora's antennae drooped slightly, a gesture of defeat that transcended species barriers. "Captain, there are aspects of Ixaran culture that are complicated. Internal matters that are about to become external matters," Imogen interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. "Because those internal matters are currently sitting under my conference table, and I need to know what I'm dealing with. Are the cubs in danger if they return to Ixora?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Kumthul's mandibles worked silently, clicking through what looked like several different responses before settling on stony silence. It was Lixapora who finally spoke, and when she did, her words came through the translator with a flatness that suggested she'd turned off whatever emotional modulation Ixaran's speech normally carried. "Yes," she said simply. "They are in grave danger." Tully felt something in her chest clench. Beneath the table, Moku pressed harder against her leg, as if he could sense the shift in the room's emotional temperature. "The sacred status of Mokhtar is propaganda," Lixapora continued, and Kumthul made a sound like grinding metal, but she ignored him. "A convenient fiction we tell ourselves and others to justify what we do to them. The truth is that Mokhtar cubs are taken from their mothers at their birth and subjected to a conditioning process that strips away their natural behavioral patterns and replaces them with artificial ones. They are taught, no, forced, to respond to chemical commands, to be aggressive on demand, to attack designated targets without question or hesitation." "Bioweapons," Ox said quietly from his position by the door. "You're describing the creation of bioweapons." "Living weapons," Lixapora confirmed, "used in territorial disputes, in the suppression of dissent, in situations where deploying traditional military assets would be too visible or too costly. Mokhtar don't question orders. They don't refuse commands. They don't hesitate. And when they die in service, we call them heroes and take more cubs to replace them. Tully felt sick. Under the table, her hand found Moku's head, fingers tangling in his soft fur. He leaned into the touch, that almost purr vibrating through her palm. "How long has this been going on?" Imogen asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Generations," Lixapora said. "Long enough that most Ixarans don't question it anymore. Long enough that we've forgotten what Mkar were before we started conditioning them. There are reformist factions. I belong to one, but we're a minority. The military controls the breeding programs, the conditioning facilities. Commander Kumthul represents their interests." "This is treason," Kumthul hissed, finally breaking his silence. "You reveal state secrets to humans. You undermine our security. I tell the truth to people who accidentally discovered it anyway." Lixapora snapped back, her translator catching what sounded like anger despite the mechanical nature of the rendering. "The moment those cubs failed to respond to your command pheromones, this conversation became inevitable. Or did you think the humans wouldn't notice that something was fundamentally wrong with our claims?" Tully's mind was racing, pieces clicking together like a puzzle she wished she'd never started. "The mining accident," she said slowly. "It wasn't an accident, was it? You were trying to capture the mother and cubs. For conditioning." Lixapora's antennae dipped in what might have been acknowledgement or shame. "Wild Mkar are rare. Most live in controlled facilities. The few that remain free are considered genetic stock for the breeding programs. When we detected the den, Commander Kumthul's unit was dispatched to secure it. The mother fought back. The den collapsed. She died protecting her cubs from us. Under the table, Obsidian made a low sound that was somewhere between a growl and a mourning sound that Tully had never heard from any of them before. Lunk shifted, pressing against his smaller siblings, providing comfort, or seeking it. "And the cubs survived," Tully said, her voice tight. "So I pulled them from the rubble, thinking I was saving them. But I was really just delaying the inevitable, wasn't I? You were always going to come for them." "The conditioning must begin young," Kumthul said, and there was something almost like regret in his tone. "Almost. Cubs older than 3 months become increasingly resistant to the pheromone protocols. These cubs are nearly past the optimal window. If they return to Exxaran now, the conditioning might still take hold. If we wait much longer, they'll be useless." "Useless," Tully repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. "You mean they'll be free." "I mean they'll be dangerous," Kumthul corrected. "Unconditioned Mkar are apex predators with intelligence that rivals sentient species. They pack hunt. They problem solve. They hold grudges. Do you understand what you've created here, Specialist? 3 predators who've bonded to a human instead of responding to Ixaran control. 3 potential weapons that answer to no one but you." "They're not weapons," Tully said fiercely. "They're children. Traumatized children who watched their mother die and then found someone who treated them with kindness instead of trying to break them into tools." "Semantics," Kumthul dismissed. "The result is the same. They're bonded to you, which makes them unpredictable, dangerous. The only responsible course of action is to return them to Exxaran for proper conditioning before they become a threat." "Or we could let them be what they are," Ox interjected, and everyone turned to look at him. He shrugged, looking mildly uncomfortable with the attention. "Just offering an alternative perspective." "You cannot be serious," Kumthul said, mandibles clicking rapidly in what the translator helpfully labeled as extreme agitation. These are not house pets. These are predators capable of killing multiple beings in seconds, without conditioning, without control mechanisms. They've been on this ship for 6 weeks, Ox interrupted, his tone matter-of-fact. In that time, they've committed exactly 0 attacks on personnel. They've stolen approximately 30 pairs of socks, destroyed 2 couches, and figured out how to open every door on Deck 3. But they haven't hurt anyone. Not even when Ensign Cole accidentally stepped on Lunk's tail, and he yelped loud enough to trigger the audio sensors. Tully blinked. I didn't know about that. Because it was a non-incident, Ox said. Lunk yelped. Cole apologized. The cub accepted head scratches as restitution, and everyone moved on with their day. These cubs have had multiple opportunities to exhibit the dangerous behavior Commander Kumthul claims is inevitable. They haven't taken them. They silenced an alarm clock by sitting on it, Tully added, warming to the theme. That's not aggression. That's problem-solving motivated by not wanting me to leave. This morning's escape wasn't an escape at all. They tracked me through the entire ship to make sure I was safe. That's protective behavior. Social bonding. The exact opposite of what you'd expect from conditioned killing machines. It proves nothing, Kumthul insisted, but he sounded less certain now. They're young. Their instincts haven't fully developed. Give them time, and they'll what? Imogen asked, leaning forward. Become the monsters you tried to make them? Or will they become what they should have been all along? Intelligent predators capable of forming bonds and making choices. Captain, with respect, you don't understand the political implications. Then explain them to me, Commander, slowly. Because from where I'm sitting, the political implications are that your government has been running an illegal bioweapon program in violation of approximately 50 interstellar treaties, and you're worried that 3 cubs might expose that fact by having the audacity to not be weapons. Kumthul stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the deck plating with a sound like nails on metal. This conversation is over. The cubs will be returned to Ixaran custody. Ambassador Lixapora is clearly compromised by her reformist sympathies. I will be filing a formal complaint with the lights went out. Not the emergency lights, not the backup systems. Everything. Complete darkness for exactly 3 seconds before the emergency protocols kicked in and bathed the room in red emergency lighting that made everyone look like they were rehearsing for a particularly ominous theatrical production. What just happened? Imogen demanded, already moving toward the door. Ox had his communicator out, the device's screen providing a small pool of blue light in the red-washed room. Ship-wide power fluctuation. Systems are rebooting. It's coming from... He paused, his expression doing something complicated. From the habitat section. Someone accessed the main power junction. Tully's blood turned to ice. The cubs can't access power junctions. They don't have opposable thumbs. They don't... She looked down. 3 pairs of luminescent eyes looked back at her from under the table. All cubs accounted for. All exactly where they'd been when the lights went out. It's not the cubs, Ox said slowly, reading something on his communicator screen that made his jaw tighten. It's someone using the security codes from your quarters, Tully. Someone who knew exactly which junction to hit to cause a ship-wide distraction without triggering critical system failures. Everyone looked at everyone else. Kumthul's mandibles had gone completely still. Lixapora's antennae were vibrating so fast they were humming. And Imogen, captain of the Pathmaker, veteran of more diplomatic incidents than she cared to count, smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Well, she said conversationally, this just became significantly more interesting. Ox, lock down this section. Nobody leaves until we figure out who's sabotaging my ship. Ambassador? Commander? I think it's time we discussed exactly who else might not want these cubs returning to Ixora. Under the table, Moku chirped softly and pressed his face against Tully's hand. The cubs hadn't silenced her alarm to be mischievous, she realized. They'd been trying to delay her, trying to keep her safe. The question was, safe from what? The lockdown lasted exactly 8 minutes before someone started pounding on the conference room door with enough force to make the metal resonate like a gong. "Captain Imogen!" came a voice through the comm system, female and carrying the kind of accent that suggested someone had learned standard from textbooks, rather than conversation. "This is Dr. Priya. I need immediate access to that room. I have information about the power fluctuation." Imogen and Ox exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that people who'd worked together for too long could have without words. Ox moved to the door control, weapon drawn but pointed at the floor, and triggered the release. Dr. Priya stumbled through like she'd been leaning her full weight against the door, wild-eyed and clutching a data tablet to her chest, like it contained the secrets of the universe. She was the Pathmaker's systems engineer, a woman who normally looked like she'd just stepped out of a technical manual, all pressed uniforms and regulation everything. Right now, she looked like she'd been dragged backward through a maintenance tunnel. "The power fluctuation wasn't sabotage," she gasped, trying to catch her breath. "It was an upload. Someone used the junction in the habitat section to bypass security protocols and dump approximately 600 gigabytes of data into the public broadcast network." The silence that followed could have had its own gravity well. "What data?" Imogen asked, her voice dangerously calm. Priya's hands shook as she held up the tablet, its screen showing a cascade of files and video feeds. "Everything. Conditioning facility schematics, chemical formulations for the command pheromones, training protocols, video documentation of Mkar cubs being subjected to—" She paused, her face going pale. "To procedures that violate every sentient rights treaty in the known galaxy." Kumthul made a sound like tearing metal. "That's classified Ixaran military intelligence. Accessing it, distributing it, that's an act of war." "That's accountability," Lixapora corrected quietly, and suddenly every antenna on her body was pointed directly at the commander. "That's the truth, finally getting out where the military can't suppress it anymore. That's what I've been working toward for 5 planetary cycles." The pieces clicked together in Tully's mind with the finality of a locking mechanism. "You leaked it. You used my access codes because I was the one who found the cubs. You made it look like it came from me because a human whistleblower makes better optics than an Ixaran traitor." "I prefer the term reformist with initiative," Lixapora said, and despite the translator's limitations, Tully could have sworn she heard the ghost of dry humor in there. "And yes, I uploaded the files during the meeting, timed to coincide with Commander Kumthul's attempt to use command pheromones. I needed video documentation of cubs rejecting the conditioning, and you helpfully provided that." "You used us," Ox said, his weapon rising slightly. "I used the situation," Lixapora corrected. "The cubs were always in danger. The conditioning program was always going to continue. The only way to stop it was to expose it so thoroughly, so publicly, that even the military couldn't hide behind propaganda and cultural tradition anymore. As of 3 minutes ago, every major news network in 5 sectors has access to the full documentation of Exxaran bioweapon programs. The Interstellar Court has been automatically notified. There's no putting this back in the box." Kumthul lunged, or tried to, But Ox was faster. The security officer had his weapon trained on the commander's center mass before the Ixaran could take 2 steps, and something in Ox's expression suggested he would be absolutely fine with pulling the trigger. "Stand down, Commander," Imogen ordered. "This is still my ship, and I don't care what your rank is on Ixora. Here, you follow my rules." "You're harboring a traitor," Kumthul hissed, his whole body vibrating with rage. "This is an act of aggression against the Ixaran state." "This is an Ixaran internal matter that happened to occur on a human vessel," Imogen corrected smoothly. "We're neutral parties who will cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation. Ox, please escort Commander Kumthul to secure quarters. For his own protection, of course. Things are about to get very complicated, and I'd hate for the commander to be caught in any unfortunate crossfire." It was a polite way of saying, arrest him before he does something we'll all regret. And everyone in the room knew it. Ox moved forward with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested he'd been waiting for an excuse to do exactly this since the moment Kumthul had walked onto the ship. "This isn't over," Kumthul snarled as Ox guided him toward the door. "The military will respond. They'll have approximately 48 hours before the Interstellar Court freezes their assets and launches a full investigation," Lixapora interrupted calmly. "I know because I've been coordinating with the reform movement for months. We have coalition support. We have public sympathy. We have evidence. What does the military have? A collapsing propaganda narrative and a lot of explaining to do." The door slid shut behind Ox and Kumthul, leaving Tully, Imogen, Lixapora, and 3 increasingly restless cubs in the conference room. Moku had emerged from under the table and was currently attempting to climb into Tully's lap, which was adorable but complicated by the fact that he weighed more than most pieces of furniture. "So," Imogen said, leaning back in her chair with the air of someone reassessing their entire morning, "let me make sure I understand this. You, Ambassador, orchestrated an 8-day interstellar incident on my ship, using my personnel as unwitting accomplices to expose your own government's illegal bioweapon program. Does that about cover it?" "In broad strokes, yes," Lixapora agreed, "though I prefer to think of it as leveraging an unfortunate situation for maximum reform impact." "And the cubs?" "We'll need asylum," Lixapora said, her tone softening slightly. "I can't guarantee their safety on Exxora anymore. The military will want them destroyed as evidence. The reform movement will want them protected as symbols. They're better off here, with someone who already cares for them." "Convenient," Imogen observed. "And what happens to you, Ambassador?" "I return to Exxora to face whatever consequences await," Lixapora said simply. "I've committed treason by my government's standards, but I've also sparked a reform movement that was already simmering. Sometimes you have to break the rules to change them." Tully looked down at Moku, who had successfully achieved lap occupancy and was now purring. Actually purring, not the almost purr, but a real, genuine vibration of contentment. Obsidian and Lunk had emerged from under the table as well, flanking her chair like guards, their crystalline whiskers catching the emergency lighting and scattering it in rainbow patterns across the walls. "We're keeping them," Tully said, and it wasn't a question. "I don't care what paperwork needs to be filed or what protocols need to be bent. They stay." "Agreed," Imogen said, surprising exactly no one who'd ever worked with her. "We'll file them as refugees under Human Coalition asylum protocols. Their legal status as sentient beings rather than property should be interesting to establish, but I've handled worse legal tangles." "Have you?" Lixapora asked, genuine curiosity in her translated voice. "No," Imogen admitted. But I wasn't going to let her know that. 3 months later, Tully woke to silence again. This time she knew immediately what had happened before she even opened her eyes. The chronometer read 0600, which meant she was late for her morning check-in with the xenobiology lab. It also meant that 3 Mokhtar cubs, significantly larger now, well-fed and well-loved, had once again committed alarm clock murder through the strategic application of sitting. She could feel the weight of them on and around her bed. Moku had claimed his usual position directly on top of the alarm, while Obsidian and Lunk had apparently decided that the best way to ensure she stayed put was to pin the blankets down with their combined mass. "You're menaces," she informed them, not moving. "Absolute menaces, and I should have left you on Ixaran." Moku chirped, a sound that clearly communicated, "You love us, and you know it." He wasn't wrong. Outside her quarters, the Pathmaker continued its journey through space. Back on Exxaran, the reform movement was slowly dismantling centuries of conditioning programs. The Interstellar Court had launched investigations. Commander Kumthul was awaiting trial. Ambassador Lixapora, now just Lixapora, stripped of her title but celebrated by reformists, was leading the charge to establish new protections for Mokhtar. And here, in her quarters, 3 cubs who should have been weapons were instead just children. Mischievous, alarm-silencing, sock-stealing children who'd figured out that the best way to keep their human around was to physically prevent her from hearing anything that might make her leave. Tully reached out and scratched behind Moku's ears, earning a deeper purr. Through her door, she could hear Ox in the corridor, probably posting someone to make sure the cubs didn't decide to stage another ship-wide expedition. Her comm chimed, a backup alarm she'd wisely placed across the room, and Tully groaned. Okay, I'm getting up." The cubs remained unmoved, literally and figuratively. "This is mutiny," she told them, exactly as she had 3 months ago. Adorable, furry mutiny. Moku's eyes glowed brighter, and if Tully didn't know better, she'd swear he was laughing at her. Maybe she'd be late for her lab check-in. Maybe Imogen would give her that look that suggested paperwork was in her future. Maybe the cubs would spend the day stealing more socks and figuring out new and creative ways to cause chaos. But they'd do it together, and they'd do it free. And that was worth every silenced alarm in the galaxy.